All right, in this lesson, we're going to talk about some of the other evidence for evolution. We've been talking about fossils, and you're probably familiar with this little guy. We looked at him in class. It's a trilobite. But now we're going to talk about some of the other evidence for evolution. How do we know evolution is a possibility? How do we know natural selection happened? The first is some anatomical evidence that we're going to talk about. The first is homologous structures. This word is homologous. These are structures that have different functions and different appearance. They look different, but inside their basic form and layout is the same. And this shows you that they have a common ancestor. That is, that they share some kind of a connection in their evolutionary past. One example of this is the bones that are in the forelimb of mammals. So if you look inside of an arm or a leg of a mammal, they have the same structure inside. So here's what I'm talking about. If we were to look at the limbs of bats, humans, lions, horses, frogs, and whales, we see basically the same structure. There's a large bone, there's two smaller bones, there's a clump, and then digits, or like fingers. Okay, we have a larger bone, larger bone, larger bone, larger bone, larger bone. And then we've got two here, two here. This one is kind of strange. The horse's leg has been changed quite a lot, but basically there's two bones here that are fused. And then we have the frog. Okay, and then down below you've got your clump, and then you've got your digits, even digits in the cat, or this is a lion. The horse's digits are changed quite a lot, but even in the bat you have the digits, okay, the phalanges they're called. So even though these organisms are using their limbs for very different things, one's flying, one's running, one's swimming, inside they look very similar. This is called homologous structures. Then we have something similar to that, and that is analogous structures. This is another kind of anatomical evidence. Analogous structures are structures that have a common function, and so they look the same, but they're in organisms that aren't related at all. So it's like a common solution based on the environment. We sometimes call this convergent evolution. Okay, evolution has converged. And this is a situation where the environment says, hey, this is the solution. This is what's going to work. And so no matter what kind of organism you're talking about, you have the similar solution. It's going to look the same. An example of this is wings. So we have birds, we have bats, we have insects, and we even have plants that have wings. And the wing structure is going to look the same. So here's what I'm talking about. Here we have a bird's wing. We have a pterosaur, which is a reptile, an extinct reptile from the time of the dinosaurs. We have a bat, which is a mammal. We have a butterfly, which is an insect. And then this is the seed from a maple tree. And it actually has these two wings. There's two seeds here, one here and one here. And it has these wings, and it actually can fly sort of out of the tree to find a place to grow. And so even though these are very different organisms, you see the structure of the wing is pretty similar in each case, and because the task was to figure out how to fly, or not really figure it out, but adapt to be able to fly. Another type of anatomical evidence has to do with embryos, little tiny growing babies. The embryos of many different organisms share common characteristics, and that shows that they're related, that by their evolutionary heritage, they're related in the past. For example, we can look at the embryo of a human, we can look at a chicken, a snake, a salamander, and a fish. And you can see that in each one there's a tail. Yes, indeed, in a human embryo there's a tail. It later goes away before the baby is born, but in the embryo it's there. A chicken has a tail, even though its tail looks quite different when it's hatched out of its egg. And then the other is, it says here pharyngeal pouches or gill slits. So here we have in the human, gills. Salamander, fish, chicken, and snake all show these gills that later disappear, but sort of show us that we were related at some point to fish. That fish have gills and we have these gills. It's kind of interesting to look at all kinds of embryos. Here we have a whole range of embryos: fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, pig, calf, rabbit, and human. If we look at them late in development, you can clearly see they're different. But if you look early in development, look at how similar they are. You almost couldn't tell the difference between those embryos early in development. And that tells you that these embryos, the organisms, are very closely related. They have an evolutionary past that they share together. They're connected in some way. You can even see the ones that are most related here, because later in development they still look very similar. These ones start to look different. The fish and the salamander and the tortoise and the chick start to look very different. But these are all mammals, so they all look very similar. The last bit of evidence I want to talk about is for vestigial structures. Vestigial means a structure that really isn't doing anything in the organism. It's there, but it serves no function. But it's sort of left over from the past, from evolutionary past. It seems like at one time maybe it did have a structure, a function, but it doesn't anymore. One example of this is whales. Whales are fascinating because inside there, of course, they have no legs, but inside there they have a pelvis. They have hip bones. And of course, a pelvis, hip bones, are only for attaching legs. That's what they're there for. And they don't have any legs, so why do they have these hip bones? Well, it's because they used to have legs. Whales used to walk on land. And in fact, in this picture of this humpback whale, this little bone right here is actually a tiny little leftover leg bone. It's the femur bone, which is the thigh bone, the top part of your leg. And so whales have that left over because they used to have legs. And here's some more examples. I already talked about humans having tail bones. That's vestigial. And we also have muscles that used to work to wiggle your ears. They don't really work very well anymore. But of course, you think about monkeys, you think about other kinds of mammals, dogs, cats, they can move their ears around. We can't, but we do still have some of those muscles left over. They're not really doing anything anymore. And also, we talked about whales having hip bones. Snakes also have hip bones. And as you know, snakes don't have legs, although some species of snake actually do have some teeny tiny little legs that don't really help them to walk anymore, but they're just still there, left over. Here's an actual photograph of a boa constrictor that has these tiny legs. So that's an example of vestigial structures, structures that presumably did something in the past, but they're just left over and they don't do anything anymore. So it's kind of a short lesson. I'm sure you appreciate that, and that's it for this one. Remember, these notes go on page 15.